In his book, An Examined Faith, James Luther Adams related the following story. I was very influenced in my youth, Adams said, by reading the autobiography of George Gordon. Gordon was a miner's son who was admitted to Harvard College as a special student without the normal prerequisites. In fact, I believe, said Adams, he is the only person in the history of Harvard who was given a degree by acclamation after 2 years. Apparently, this George was a very smart fellow. While studying Greek at Harvard, Gordon came in for the midterm exam. His professor said, "You're not permitted to take the exam, you're a special student." Gordon replied, "But I'd like to take it." No, you're not getting credit," the teacher said. "You don't need to take it." Gordon protested. "You make me feel like an idiot. I'm not even worth being examined." George Gordon concluded the story by saying, "The meaning of human existence is to live in a community where there are standards, where there is judgment. If you don't live in a community where there is a shared sense of judgment and ultimately the judgment of God, then you're not on the way to becoming human." In other words, we must be held accountable to that truth, that moral principle, that ultimate source of existence, not of human hands, that we find of ultimate value in our lives. That is our God. Do you find it difficult today to watch the news? Do you get depressed, just exhausted, depressed, just hearing of the latest tweets and reports that seem to flow out like a deluge from the darkness of the night? I miss Walter Cronkite. Lately in my life, I have grown so tired of caring. I get weary understanding that the problems never end. We ignite our candles of hope and faith each week. We light our tiny chalice flame and dedicate our lives and our resources to the cause of justice, love, and compassion. But the parade of calamities goes on. Global warming, hate crimes, mass killings, the plight of immigrants, homelessness, and poverty. I don't know if it's just a phase related to my age and declining physical condition or my emotional health perhaps, but I just feel sometimes I have no more to give. I feel like a tiger in a cage. Several years ago, Sekio spoke to us on the topic of living with catastrophe. In the written introduction to his sermon, Sekio said, "As compassionate people, we can't ignore such events, yet we want to maintain equanimity in our lives and even temperament. We can learn to do this," he said, "without letting calmness become complacency." So whenever I find myself in the struggle between calmness and complacency, between restoration and resignation, between wanting to save the world and wanting to escape it, I pick up a book and I read about the history of Unitarian Universalism. I recall to mind the stories of commitment to our faith, the ministers and social activists, James Reeb, who died in Selma, Alabama, Susan Anthony and the women's suffrage movement, Clarence Skinner and his social gospel, all the amazing who's who of our Unitarian and Universalist heritage. And I think about James Luther Adams, who said, faith is not fundamentally about one's beliefs, but about one's commitments. Adams was born in 1901 and died in 1994. Professor Adams, in an essay, shared the story of his upbringing and later conversion, as he calls it. Raised by a fundamentalist Baptist minister, he later rejected his religion of origin while attending the University of Minnesota. Not only rejected his childhood faith, he went after it with a vengeance. He said, whenever my turn came in a public speaking class, I usually gave a speech against religion. I enjoyed shocking the pious students in the class, attacking bibliolatry, creationism, self-righteousness, hostility to modern culture. Wow! A century gone by, our same battles. He even edited a radical campus paper called The Angels' Revolt. No wonder I like this guy. He reminds me of myself. The youthful arrogance, rebellion from a worn-out Baptist upbringing, a search for deeper truth and meaning in his life, and a strong impulse to save the world. One day in his senior year, James said to his college professor that he had no idea what he was going to do upon graduation. The professor replied, "Oh, really? I have known the answer to that for quite some time. Come and see me if you want to discuss it." I went to his office on a Saturday morning, Adams wrote, and we talked for 3.5 hours. He told me that I was provincial and naive, that I apparently had never encountered a self-critical religion, and that this was the reason for my blanket hostility. He went on to say that obviously my most passionate interest was religion. That's all he talked about. That professor, of course, turned out to be Unitarian. Adams went on to graduate from Harvard Divinity School and become a minister in the Unitarian faith. In the mid-1930s, he traveled to Germany and spent a summer at Heidelberg University, where he first encountered Nazi students. He said, "One day in Nuremberg, I was almost beaten up by Nazi, quote, heroes at a rally." A decade later, Adams was back in Nazi Germany with a Harvard classmate who had just served time in a concentration camp. Immediately on release from Dachau, Adams reported, the classmate resumed his leadership in the dangerous anti-Nazi underground, the movement of the so-called confessing churches. James himself was later taken in by the Gestapo and nearly arrested. It made a lifelong impact. I came to appreciate the vocation, he said, the calling of prophetic religion in its struggle against the false gods of idolatry, racism, classism, and sexism. I learned the meaning of the commandment, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." I learned that as soon as the universal God is forgotten, false gods rush in to fill the vacuum. In 2005, Christopher Walton wrote an article on atoms for our own UU World magazine. In it, he said when Adams went to Germany to study with some of the greatest theologians of the time, he confronted a deeply unsettling fact. Germany's churches were not effectively resisting the rise of Hitler. Adams had high expectations for Germany's long tradition of liberal theology. These were the same German thinkers, in fact, who would later profoundly affect my own religious sensibilities and liberalize many other Baptist seminary students in the 1970s. And yet, as Walton said in his UU World article, German liberalism had not foreseen the Nazi threat, nor did it seem to offer adequate resources for resistance. What can this mean for us today? One of the failings in our religious history has been ignoring the tragic side of human nature, evil. Walton reported that Adams' experience in Europe left a lasting mark on his thinking. At Meadville Lombard, the University of Chicago, Harvard, and Andover Newton, Adams became famous as a teacher and mentor to a generation of scholars and ministers. He championed themes that have never been UU favorites: conversion and guilt, sacrifice and discipline, conflict and tragedy. Without them, Adams believed, liberal religion becomes complacent, accommodating cultural trends that distort liberal values when resistance is called for. 4 centuries earlier, Martin Luther had risen up against the abuses of the Catholic Church and proclaimed the priesthood of all believers, which meant that no one needed a pope or a priest or a minister to intercede for them. We all have a direct line to our own religious faith. This is what we preach as Unitarian Universalists. James Luther Adams carried it one step further and declared the prophethood of all believers. We are called upon to speak and act as prophets against injustice anywhere it is encountered. He said, I came to ask myself the question, in my preaching and my political action, what is it there that would stop this sort of atrocity? What is it in my own life that would speak against such abuses? It's a liberal attitude to say that we keep ourselves informed and read the best papers, watch NPR and listen, but to be involved with other people so that it costs, so that one exposes the evils of society, requires something like conversion. Adam said it replies something more than an attitude. It requires a sense that there's something very wrong and I must be different from the way I have been. I remember when I first became a bleeding heart. It was because Jesus taught me that the most important thing that I could ever do is love another human being. When I first became a social activist, it was because my ethics professor, Dr. Henley Barnett, and others challenged me to live my convictions. When I first became Unitarian Universalist, it was because Mary Claire Vanderhorst in the Jacksonville church inspired me to demonstrate against the nuclear arms race and the testing of weapons at Cape Canaveral. And Peg McIntyre from the St. Augustine UU Church was still going strong at the age of 90, rallying for justice. I met John and Martina Lanahan, who ran a center out of their home in St. Mary's, Georgia, to teach pacifist resistance and keep vigil over those ominous white trains leaving the Navy base with their deadly cargo of nuclear warheads rolling through our southern neighborhoods. John is at it still, some 30 years gone by at Kings Bay. You see, although I've been an activist for most of my adult life, buoyed by these wonderful associations, I've never grown fully comfortable in that role. I'm not a leader, I'm a follower. I find the only way I can sustain those practices is through the collective strength of others in my spiritual orbit. So I give thanks to those of you who continually, in spite of setbacks and frustrations, carry on the good fight. Adams often said, "An unexamined faith is not worth having, for it can be true only by accident." UU minister George Kimmich Beach is a former student and friend of Adams. I met the Reverend Beach when he served for a year as interim minister at the UU Church of Jacksonville. He edited a number of books by Adams, including the one on which this sermon is based, An Examined Faith. In his introduction to that book, Reverend Beach said, "An authentic religious community is one that constantly encourages and challenges its members to examine their faith." But here is the most important element of Adams' message. Examining one's faith is not a solitary exercise. That's what we are here for. That's why we gather in community. Why we take the trouble to create our churches, so that when we grow so tired of caring, get so weary thinking that the problems never end, hear the voices telling us that we are weak and pitiful tigers, then our candles of hope and faith can be relit by one another. When I entered the Unitarian ministry, Adams said, I became increasingly distressed by what I called vociferous individualism. The claim that religious authenticity depends upon your individual freedom. This raised the question, what then is the basis for community? It's the same question we were raising 60 years later when I became a minister. Why do we come together? As a liberal religion, we rebelled so strongly against ecclesiastical authority of any sort that we became what Adams called a church of me, me, me. And what I think and my freedom. The idea that when you became a Unitarian, you are free to do your own thing. If that's the case, we might as well be walking in the woods or hibernating in a hermitage to practice our religion. Speaking once about false prophets, Jesus said, "By their fruits you shall know them." James Luther Adams said, "By their groups you shall know them." Reverend Beach wrote, "Liberalism must no longer be confused with lax, uncritical, or mere broad-minded attitudes, least of all in an age of rising tyrannies. The aim of religious awareness, religious faith, religious community, and religious life must be radical change. There is no such thing as personal salvation."